Thank you so much, Robert, for joining us and for taking time out of your day to come and speak to us and inspire us and the audience. If you're listening and you don't know who Robert Greene is, then he's a New York Times best-selling American author known for his books on strategy, power, and seduction. He has written not one, not two, but 6 international bestsellers, including The 48 Laws of Power, The Art of Seduction, The 33 Strategies on War, The 50th Law, written with 50 Cent, Mystery, and most recently the fabulous The Laws of Human Nature. Some say that he is the #1 modern-day philosopher of our time, with his brilliant works on dissecting the very core of human behaviour. He's also the most quoted leader in Inspired Minds, and we're all super massive fans. And if you don't know what Inspired Minds is, then we're a global community of 54,000 people from across an interdisciplinary background in tech and science. Our founder, Sarah Porter, is the biggest Robert Greene fan, self-proclaimed, but you can attest to that. And as a team, as Inspired Minds, we famously campaigned against Trump when he banned the All Future Girl Afghan robotics team from participating at the Washington Robotics Championship because they were Muslim. And we tackle big issues facing humanity like climate, health, education, and gender inequality head on using emerging technology. T-minus30, which is what this interview is coming under, is our latest project, uniting game changers to use philosophy, tech, and science to build a better future, of which you are one of those incredible game changers who we are so lucky to have on board with us. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Very
so I'd
exciting.
like to maybe...
I didn't know about Inspired.
Really? Well, now you know some more about us. Hopefully,
okay.
That's super exciting. So maybe to kick off, we can by talking about emotions and mental habits, good and bad. But before, let's start with some quick fire answer questions just to get excited and test technology to see if it really can keep up with the quick fire. But if you could choose 5 people, dead or alive, to be in isolation with right now, Robert, who would they be and why?
Well, I'm kind of an antiquity person. My major was classics. So I would choose the real life Odysseus. You know, I would love to spend time with him. He's one of my heroes. I would also spend time with Buddha because I practice a form of Zen Buddhism and I admire him tremendously. On the other side of the scale, I would spend time with Napoleon Bonaparte because I'm fascinated by him. There's a writer, a woman named Lou Andrea Salome that you may not have heard of, who I've written about, who's actually one of the most brilliant writers in the late 19th century. She was friends with Nietzsche and Freud and all these other people. So she'd have some amazing stories to tell. And then I would add probably Martin Luther King because he was one of my favorite subjects for my last book. And I felt like I kind of came to know him in some way. I could identify with him, even though I come from a much different background. So that would be a very interesting group to have in my little office here in Los Angeles.
That's definitely a wide range of people who would have some really interesting discussions together. I know that my friend started the Nietzsche Society in Oxford, so having friends of Nietzsche would be super interesting to speak to.
It would. I would certainly include Nietzsche, but you only gave me 5, so.
Maybe a 6th. Nietzsche can be an honorary 6th member.
Right.
Maybe the audience and the listeners and I would love to know what your most frequently used saying or maybe swear word, which we love, would be.
Well, I find myself saying most of all to people, let go. And what I mean by that is I'm hearing stories, people telling me about their past problems, their issues with life. And sometimes I even say it to my cat when he's grabbing something and I want him to let go. But like, let go of things. Just learn how the basic habit of letting go of the pain, of letting go of the past, of letting go of all of your emotional trauma. So when I'm dealing with like consulting or people telling me about their problems in life, it's just very simple advice. It's not easy to do, but just develop the habit of letting go of things. It's, to me, probably the phrase I end up using the most.
It's one of those very simple sayings that is very hard in practice, but very important to implement in practice as well.
Or I often say it in French too, laisse tomber, because I like the way it sounds in
French. That sounds more eloquent than the English, but as French often is. I wonder, maybe speaking of France and other countries and traveling or just enjoying things in life, maybe what you're most looking forward to doing post-lockdown, once we can let go of our current situation.
Well, I like to swim. That was my greatest sort of way of getting out of my mind and relaxing. And I can't go to the gym now, and I can't be in water. Water means so much to me. So that would be the first thing I would do. It's like at night, I'm dreaming constantly about swimming and water, and not to be able to be immersed in water is deeply distressing to me. So I would just, as soon as it's over, I'm racing to the gym and I'm getting in that pool.
Do you have a favorite body of water that is your favorite place to swim in?
Well, I remember swimming in the Mediterranean off the island of Capri many years ago. That was incredibly exciting. And then Hawaii has some of the water in Hawaii is like opium to me, or heroin. It smells so good. It's so fresh. It's so clean. After I come back from Hawaii, it's all I think about was the water. And Mexico, down in the Yucatan Peninsula, those would be my three places that I would go. But unfortunately, I'm sort of trapped in a swimming pool here. But it's a very nice swimming pool that we have here in the place that I go to.
Oh, I'm the same. Hawaii. Every time I've gone to Hawaii, I come back only being able to think about Hawaii. So I very much understand.
What's your favorite island?
Maui, probably.
That has the best
Oahu.
beach.
It's just so beautiful.
Have you ever been to the Big Island?
I have never. That's on my bucket list of places to go.
Big Island and Kauai are pretty spectacular. Anyway, we won't go into that now. But
well, it's a good advice to know in the future. Well, maybe if you picture yourself on the beach in Hawaii or back in your office back home, what book are you reading right now and why?
well, it's sort of a difficult question for me because I read 2 or 3 books a week because I'm doing research for my next book. But the book that I just finished is called A History of a Voyage to the Land of Brazil. It was written by a Frenchman named Jean de Lery. He was one of the very first Europeans to go to Brazil. It was in the 1550s. He was a missionary. And it's a fascinating book. Anthropologists nowadays, like Claude Lévi-Strauss, are quoting it because he was one of the first Europeans there, and he gave an incredibly sympathetic portrait of the indigenous people, which was incredibly unusual. It had a massive inspiration on European culture. So writers like Montaigne, and then in the 18th century, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So he created this image of the kind of the indigenous person being almost superior to Western civilization, as if they were more civilized than those in Europe. And it was a fascinating book because, his impressions is like, it's so raw, it's so weird. Nobody else had ever seen like indigenous people before, or had been very rare. So the experience was so jarring. It was a fascinating book. I really enjoyed it.
That count is so positive. Like, how does that link into the new book that you're writing? Like, what's that all about? That's so exciting.
Well, it's very hard for me to explain the new book. I'm notoriously bad at explaining my future projects. I'm better at writing them. But it's about what I call the sublime. It's sort of something I just touched upon in my last book, In the Laws of Human Nature, particularly in the last chapter on death and confronting your mortality. And sublime are experiences that are very difficult to put into words, that are very overpowering, that take us beyond our usual limits in life. And I believe that it's something extremely missing in our culture. So I feel like people are so mired in their day-to-day, in the banalities of life, they have no sense of the absolute uncanniness, the absolute amazing fact that we're even alive here talking right now. That if you understand where we were 200,000 years ago, to even imagine that I could be talking to you right now on this computer this way is just absolutely unimaginable almost. And so we've lost a sense of that because everything in our lives we take for granted. And so the sublime is also a kind of an encounter with death. I had a near-death experience myself a year and a half ago. I suffered a stroke and I came, very close to dying myself. So it's a book about confronting our mortality and confronting our own limits and going past those limits mentally, psychologically. And this was a man who went to Brazil and he had to confront the limits of his own civilization, his own culture, and realize that there was actually something very different and actually maybe something even better than what he was experiencing in Europe. So that's what excited me about that particular book. But I'm about to start the writing of it, and I read. Usually, it takes me 200-300 books of research before I begin. So I'm reading so many books that it's hard for me to pick out which one is favorite. But that's the one I just read.
That's definitely a lot.
I hope I totally didn't confuse you about this book.
No, that's so interesting. And I think especially relevant at a time like now where we're having to go back to the very basics of appreciating what it even means to just be alive and to appreciate like the great privilege we have to be able to exist and to experience and to feel, which is super important. And that's super exciting. And I think really special to be writing about in our book, which like, especially for our founder, Sarah, as well, remind all sounds like a bit of the world, right? That it's important as well.
Not at all. Not at all. I would have that tattooed on my arm if I could, but because I almost, literally died about 18 months ago, I don't need a tattoo because it's in here. I have the feeling in my body about what that was like. So that's my memento mori, and it's very powerful. And it's very liberating, actually, to be aware of your mortality, which was the last chapter in the Laws of Human Nature.
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's just to have that feeling of living as if it's your last moment is so special. We're always told to live as if like to live our last moments and enjoy everything that we're doing, and sometimes it's hard, but to have that in a tattoo or in your brain as a brain tattoo is liberating and also helps you enjoy, I would assume, enjoy life to the fullest and appreciate it as well, which is so important. And not quite like maybe we're not looking necessarily at death or in this particular, but when we're looking at businesses and we're looking at work and we're using what we call fear setting, so thinking about the worst case scenario and working back from that, which is much like death and life, and thinking about where you're going to end up and how you can enjoy it in the present. We like to visualize the worst case and then work back about how we can evade that or avoid it, and to face our fears, but to also appreciate and enjoy. In the current COVID crisis, people young and old, we're all really scared and there's a lot of fear and uncertainty. How would you help people to face this super powerful emotion of fear setting and the worst possible outcome?
Well, I write about that a fair amount in the Laws of Human Nature. Fear is a very strange emotion because it's the one emotion that we find in almost most animals, particularly mammals, but even in lizards. And fear was an emotion that was designed to help us survive. It made us become aware of a danger in the environment, and it put all these hormones and chemicals in our body to make us alert and to look around and get our body energized so we could go into a fight or flight mode. So it's the emotion that creates the most powerful physical effects on us. And it's designed to deal with something immediate in the environment. The problem for us human beings is that we don't just have this fear reaction, we think about it, right? And so we're not designed, our minds aren't designed to handle a lot of uncertainty. We crave knowing things, we crave having solutions and answers. So this kind of virus, this kind of pandemic, plays on the worst part of human nature if we're not careful, because it's something we can't see. We don't really know its nature. We don't really know how exactly it spreads. There's so much uncertainty involved. And so the problem is that it lingers in our mind, and we can tend to exaggerate the actual fear, although it's probably better in this case to at least err on that side. But the problem, what I tell people is, what you need to do is you need to not just give into your emotions. it's not, you don't want to just feel fear and let it come over you and just accept it. You want to question your fear. You want to talk to it almost as if it's a person. You want to say, fear, what is it about? What am I actually afraid about? Who are you? What is it? What is the nature of this fear? And so if you examine it in this situation, sometimes what you're afraid of is not something that's immediately present. It's something that you hear about or that you read in the newspaper, that you got on social media. And so you want to be able to analyze what exactly you are afraid of. What is the concrete nature of this fear? So the fear for us in the immediate sense is contracting this disease, which is a horrible way to die, right? So, if you take the proper precautions as we're told to, and you're doing the social distancing, your chances are fairly good that you're not going to get it. So thinking in that way, it's best to abide by these rules that people have set, but realize that if you do that, you have a very good chance of not catching it. So that just thinking in that way will kind of mitigate your fear. The other thing is, so sometimes what you're afraid of is the future. You're afraid of what will happen to my career once this is over. Perhaps you're unemployed now suddenly, and you're facing a very uncertain future. That's a very, very real fear, right? But what you need to do is you need to analyze that. You need to not just accept the fact that you're afraid of the future, but you need to analyze why you're afraid of it. Okay, so maybe I've chosen a career path that isn't leading anywhere and is probably a bit of a dead end. Or maybe I'm afraid because I don't know if there'll be a job left for me when I get out. And when you analyze the actual details of your fear, when you make it concrete like that, then you can handle it better. And then you can say to yourself, well, maybe I need to think longer term. To me, the antidote to the kind of immediate fear is to raise your mind above the current situation and think a year or 2 or 3 years down the line. So the coronavirus will be gone in 2 or 3 years. You'll be now out back in the world. Are you going to carry these fears that you've been having that were so powerful? Are you going to be carrying them 2 or 3 years down the line? Is it going to be infecting how you relate to the job market, to the economy, to your career path? Or can you, as I said before, let go of that? And so if you can get out of the immediate and you can think, well, maybe what I need to do is reassess where I'm heading in life. Maybe I need to reassess where I'm going, what kind of job I'm going to have, what the future is going to be like. Maybe I'm in a career that doesn't have a future, right? It's going to be downsized or something. So this is a time for reflecting and getting your mind out of the immediate emotions and analyzing them and trying to project yourself further into the future and think 2 or 3 years down the line. This is a way to calm it down, to make it so that those powerful chemicals are not constantly coursing through your body. Because the thing about fear, like anything in the human body, is it becomes a habit. So neural pathways are formed in the brain. They're going to be there a year or 2 down the line, and you're going to have a fear response totally out of connection to reality based on your experience. When you have to confront some problem in your job or in a relationship, you're going to be carrying this baggage, right? And you need to let go of it. You need to be able to get out of that kind of fear habit. And so, excuse me, by kind of analyzing where your fear is coming from and challenging, not just accepting it and making it concrete and realizing these are things that will calm you down and will help you get out of that habit. Because you don't want, when this is all over, you don't want suddenly to be, a lot of people who grew up, I know my parents who grew up during the Depression. I'm older than you are, obviously. They carried their fear around with them the rest of their lives. They were constantly afraid. They didn't want to spend any money. They were very worried that tomorrow there might be another depression, and it was irrational. So you don't want to be carrying this burden around with you. So if you can develop the habit now of stepping back from your emotions and analyzing them and making them as concrete and real as possible and not exaggerated, that is a very important life skill to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that we can all definitely relate to at the moment, just the feeling of fear, but thinking about how we can turn that into something positive in the future, and thinking like, are my fears rational, and am I thinking justifiably, or is it helpful to have these fears? Is definitely something that we're all going through. And my friends always say to me when I'm having a bad day, like, hard times are character building, and we're learning from them, and we're becoming better people as a result. And I wonder if you could tell us maybe about, you touched on how we need to think about in the future and think ahead in order to think about whether our fears are rational and justifiable, so that later down the line we're not fearful for things which are irrational, and maybe how we can emerge from this better psychologically with better mental habits, and be in a better situation, almost take something that's like post-traumatic stress and turn it into a post-traumatic success.
Well, yeah, these are moments that you must learn from. When life is easy and things are going well, it almost kind of softens you up, and you're not preparing yourself, because life involves the unexpected. It involves crises, it involves problems. And now when you're confronted with this so straight on, it's a time to learn. It's a time to develop better habits. It's a time to toughen yourself up, right? So, there are many ways to use that. So one of the first things is that people are generally very bored, right? You're
Mm.
sitting in your room or your apartment or wherever you're sheltering, and you don't have parties, you don't have friends, you're not going out, you're not going to see films, and you're bored, right? And boredom is a very powerful emotion. And I always tell people, how you deal with boredom tells me a lot about your character, about who you are. Are you the kind of person that the moment you feel bored, you have to grab for something to entertain you? Do you need something, something on the internet or whatever it is to immediately distract you from your own anxieties? That's a sign to me of weakness. And you're going to be carrying that throughout your life. You won't be able to focus. To master something, I talked about in my book, Mastery. To be able to master a field of any kind, you have to have patience, and you have to be willing, you have to be able to deal with tedium, because, hours and hours of practice in anything can be rather tedious. So this is a time to develop an incredibly important inner discipline, which is, I'm not going to immediately try and distract myself or I'm not going to binge watch something on television. Instead, I'm going to take this time to begin writing a journal where I analyze my emotions. I look at myself. I write about what's going on in my life, something that'll be very interesting to look at 5 years from now. Okay, this is a time where I'm thinking deeply about my career path, about where I want to be in a few years, and maybe I need to learn something new. I need to learn a skill that I've been ignoring. Okay, this is the perfect time with the incredible richness of the internet to do that. Can you imagine if 20 years ago we had this coronavirus and we didn't really have the internet, and we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have all these ways of communicating? We'd be going absolutely apeshit, right? But now we have the internet, so you can use these riches to learn things and skills that you had been ignoring. The other thing I tell people is read books. Read as many books as you can. Develop the habit of not grabbing for something entertaining, but instead something that's going to enrich your mind. Because the mind is like a soil. You have to feed it, you have to make it rich. And if you feed it with great books and great ideas, it's a bit cliched, but amazing things will come out of that soil. And you have the time now. Don't waste it. Don't give in to boredom. Use this time. The other thing is, another great habit is to feel tremendous empathy towards other people who are suffering. So I talk about in Laws of Human Nature how humans are generally self-absorbed, that we're all narcissists. And when we're all sheltering in our little one room, we tend to have a self-pitying attitude. Woe is me. Oh, I'm so miserable. I'm so unhappy. Look at my life. And I want you to use this time to develop the opposite habit of looking at other people who have it much worse than you, of developing a kind of kinship with them, kind of kinship with their suffering and their problems. There are people a lot worse off than you who are unemployed, who are maybe even dying right now. It's also a time for confronting your mortality. You know, this is the last chapter in the Laws of Human Nature. You go around in this bubble, imagining, particularly when you're young, oh man, you know, I've got decades ahead of me. I'm never going to die. You don't say it literally, but you almost are acting as if you're never going to die. And we live in a world where you never have to confront death. You know, I was just reading a biography by a woman who wrote in the 19th century. And by the time she was 10 years old, she had seen 5 people die, some in her house, some in other people, some in the streets. It was a very visceral, real thing. We never, ever see anybody die. We never confront it, right? So we live in this unreal bubble. Now is the time for you to actually think about the very real fact that you could be dead tomorrow. And as we discussed earlier, the sense of urgency that will give you about trying to get what you need through life. I have many more because I did a video in which I was talking about these kinds of skills that you have. But those are just examples of things that you can be working on right now so that you emerge tougher and stronger and better able to handle the crises in life.
Yeah, well, that's like so important. The two of the things that I've been working on the most in isolation has been actually keeping a diary and working on reading and trying to take on new skills and stuff, which I think is so important, as you were saying, just to, even if it just means that you're passing the time but feeling productive and feeling positive about 2 or 3 years down the line, and really combining that visualizing into the future with making the most of the time is super important. And I totally agree. And as you often talk about as well, not only is it making the most of the time we have at the moment, but it's also the difference in alive time and dead time. And maybe some of us right now in isolation, instead of doing those positive things like reading or productive or doing something new, we're turning to external stimuli to dull the pain almost of my brother playing video games, or 31% increase in alcohol purchases in the UK in supermarkets, or Netflix, or whatever it is. How do we not give in to that inertia of addiction, and how do we work to create that a lifetime in a situation that might be difficult?
Well, it's not easy, but it's all a matter of a habit. So I tell people that what defines you in life in some ways is your relationship to pleasure, right? And I can almost gauge people who are successful or who are fulfilled in life by their particular relationship to pleasure. And what I mean by this is it's a known axiom that we humans are repulsed or move away from anything painful, and we're naturally drawn to things that are pleasurable. But how do you define pleasure in your life? Do you define pleasure through external sources, through things that are immediate? Do you define it by what you need right now? Like, I'm bored, I'm upset, I'm worried. I better reach for something. I better reach for that glass of vodka. I better get some online porn. I better binge watch on something on Netflix, right? So that defines you. That means that your sense of pleasure is defined in matter of minutes, right? You need 3 minutes, 2 minutes before you've got to reach for something, and that something has to be external. It has to divert you and distract you, right? Some people, if you can extend that out to an hour, maybe you watch a movie that's not so immediate, where you have to follow a course of a narrative, and after an hour or 2 hours, it gives you a sense of pleasure. That's a little bit better than having to get an immediate hit. But what if you read a book, and that book takes you a week to read, and in the beginning it's not so interesting, but as you go deeper into it, ideas start coming to you, and there's a sense of kind of an adventure. You're being taken along on a journey by this writer. After a week, you feel entertained and you feel pleasure, but it's not over 5 minutes or an hour, it's over the course of a week. Imagine if you had a project, something that you wanted to build or book or something to write or create, and it took you a month or 2 months. In that time, it's kind of painful and they're hard moments. But when it's done, at the end of 2 months, You have a sense of pride in yourself. You have a sense of, I accomplished something. And then let's say you have something bigger. You want to start a business, or you want to create a film or write a longer book. And it takes 2 or 3 years. Like for me, it takes 5 years. And then there's a lot of boring moments, a lot of tedium, a lot of practice. But when it's over, that feeling is tremendous. So you compare the feeling of 3 or 4 years of creating something that you built, that you did, that it took all your energy, that had painful moments. The satisfaction is incredibly profound. That is a lifetime. It's not dependent, those 4 years, it's not dependent on something external. It's not dependent on vodka or drugs or TV. It comes from within you. You developed it, you created it, and you had patience and you built it. That pleasure is not even pleasure, it's a sense of fulfillment. You have a profound sense of fulfillment, which can't even begin to be compared to the little immediate pleasure that you had from grabbing something immediate to distract yourself. So people who generally succeed in life are able to expand out that relationship to pleasure. They're able to move it to move that little dot from 1 month to 2 months to 3 months to a year to 2 years. They have the patience to wait 2 years to build something, knowing there's some tedium involved, but the sense of satisfaction you can't begin to describe it in words. It's so profound. And I wish every human being would feel that, because in the time that you're doing it, you're not bored, really. You feel everything coming in alive because it's your time. And the way I describe it is, when you're born in this world, you're not given anything really. Everything that you have, all the possessions in your apartment, your clothes, your cat or your dog, your parents, they can be taken away at a moment's notice. They can die, they can leave you, you can lose them, etc. But time is yours. It's the one thing that you have. You are born with it. It's from within you. You have 80 years, 70 years, 90 years to live. That is yours. That's like a goal that you carry within you. Or how are you going to use that time, the most precious thing that you have? Are you going to use it working for other people, being a slave in some job that you hate, and constantly trying to distract yourself from your own pain? Or are you going to use it for yourself, developing yourself, creating something, fulfilling some project that you want, accomplishing something that you wanted to do? That's using your own time, building it, taking that treasure and actually making something from it, making something great out of it. That is a lifetime to me.
I think what you've done there is actually put into words something that I feel super importantly about. It's like for other young people who, my friends, I don't know, I'd see them on the weekends going to the cinema or playing with their friends or watching Netflix or something whilst I was, I don't know, working towards getting into Oxford or working on a business or something. And I think actually what you've managed to do for me is put into words that exact feeling of, where is your point? How long does your pleasure extend, and how long until you get that sense of satisfaction, fulfillment, which I think is something that has just really resonated with me, actually, that it's really important, that I've really enjoyed and hearing from that about moving that point forward. So thank you so much for that. And I'd like to ask, like, also learning from other lessons and drawing on lots of other different lessons for young people and for everyone in the situation that we're in right now. Like Marcus Aurelius, he lived through the plague until it killed him, or Viktor Frankl, who was the author of Man's Search for Meaning, survived through a brutal concentration camp. Seneca was persecuted by leaders until he was forced to commit suicide. And each of them are quoted as saying it's not the situation, but how you choose to react to it. And that's what we've been talking about in making the most of the alive time and making sure that we're using this time productively and to learn new things and to make sure that we're living in the moment. So what else do you think that we can learn from history about what we're experiencing right now?
Well, we can learn that these are periods that constantly recur, that we're actually quite privileged in our 21st century world. If you read a lot of history like I do, people lived much shorter lives. Their lives were filled with incredible hardship. People, women were dying in childbirth. Most children didn't live past, you'd read about a woman who had 8 children in the early 1800s, and 6 of them died and 2 of them survived, right? There were incredible amounts of diseases that you could have. Sanitation was pretty non-existent. There was no way, if you were bored, we're talking about boredom, you had no television, no internet, hardly any books. Life was hard, a lot harsher than anything we'll ever experience in life. The world of our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents was a lot tougher than anything we're going through. That's not to discount the fact that there are people now who are genuinely suffering, who've lost a job, and people in third world countries, developing countries. So I'm qualifying that a little bit because I live in the Western world, in a relative first world country, although the United States is quickly losing that. But so, we have it actually very well compared to the past. And so you need a sense of perspective. That's why it's very important to read about history and to read books like Viktor Frankl, or to read about Seneca. Or one book that you're going to ask me later about books that I recommend is the writer Montaigne, the great French writer, the essayist. He lived in the 16th century. He had to go through the 100 years, I forget which war it was, but then there was the massacre of St. Bartholomew, incredibly brutal, violent times. And then there was the plague that also erupted. And he developed an incredible philosophy out of this. So people who've experienced these things, like Viktor Frankl, they understand that the only kind of freedom that we can have is internal, right? So when you're in a place like that, when circumstances are so terrible, a lot even worse than what we're going through right now, the only real freedom you can have is from within. And so Viktor Frankl is a great example because he was in a concentration camp. I think it was Auschwitz, but I don't remember which one. And he determined that the only way to survive something like that was to maintain some kind of inner purpose, like some sort of connection to what was meaningful in your life. So when I get out of this concentration camp, I'm going to write this book. And he memorized the book that he was going to write while he was in the concentration camp. And that gave him a meaning and a sense of purpose, and it helped him survive. So when you read books like that by Viktor Frankl or Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or all these people that we've been talking about, they teach you the fact that you need to have kind of something that's guiding you, that's beyond this particular moment. I talked about it earlier, your sense of thinking longer term, but it's also about having a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose in your life. So if you feel like, there's no real reason why I exist, why I, Joanna, am here on this planet. I don't really know why, it's not clear to me. Well, in the present moment, while you're suffering, like we're all suffering, it's going to be very difficult for you to ever get your life together once you're out of it. But if you have a sense of, no, I was meant to be, I don't know for you personally, but I was meant to start a great business or to create this foundation that's going to help the world in some way. And if you focus on that, then it makes everything in the present time so much easier to deal with. And that's internal freedom. So you might think that you're confined in your room, but you're not confined. Your mind is not confined. Your mind is free. Your mind can relate to these circumstances in a way that turns it into a positive. This is a moment where I can develop true skills, where I can figure out what the best path in life is moving forward, where I can confront my mortality. And that is a way to liberate yourself from these circumstances. So these people teach us, the main thing they teach us is that the real freedom that we all crave, comes from within. And if you develop that now in these circumstances, in 3 or 4 years, you're going to face personally another crisis in a relationship or in a business, some kind of failure, some kind of deep problem. If you've developed this ability to feel free and to be able to relate to it in a way that's, positive and life affirming, that's a skill that you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. So that's, to me, the main lesson that these people teach us, who I'm maintain lived in far worse circumstances than anything we're experiencing right now.
I agree. I think it's so difficult, us right now, living through what might be the worst time for us, to think about how people before us suffered so much worse and so much harsher conditions and circumstances, and they've taught us such valuable lessons that we can use to make our time easier. They've gone through such suffering in order to tell us what I think is so beautiful, like such a beautiful thought, that our mind is free even if we're confined to our room. And the fact that 100 years ago this has been compared to the war, but in the war people were going off fighting to save us for their lives, and we're just having to be sat at home in so much nicer conditions, and it seems almost incomparable, even if we are all suffering. And our founder has also told us to read that book that you've just mentioned, and I think that it's really important for us all that we're learning lessons and learning that there's so much that we can do from our confines, and that our mind is free even if we're inside. And I think that that's something maybe that young people struggle with now, but also in general and in wider life. We can feel really pissed off and angry at the political leaders and the situations that we're facing, such as the climate crisis and the pandemic, and it just highlights sometimes political leaders' shortfall to represent us. So maybe before I ask you about those books that you might recommend us, I'd love to know what you think that the future generation and our youth quake in a revolution that seems to be coming, but how can we use that anger positively, and how can we use our minds freely within this time, or in general, to make that movement and to make change? Or should we just be accepting the leadership as it is?
No, definitely not. Because young people, particularly Generation Y and also millennials, you're getting a really, really raw deal. And you should be angry, and your anger is justified. And there are two forms of anger. There's passive anger and there's active anger. And in my book on Laws of Human Nature, I have a chapter on leaders and authority. And I maintain that it's human nature to always feel ambivalent about your leaders. One side of you might like them, but the other side of you still, you kind of hate them and resent them. And thousands of years ago, after a couple of years, a lot of tribes would take their leader and they would literally kill him, and then find somebody else. So it's very natural for us to feel a kind of resentment over leaders. But what happens in modern times is that resentment, that anger is very passive. People don't vote. There's no kind of movement. There's no kind of actually getting together with people of your own age and creating something new, or even having a revolution. It's all very passive. And when anger is passive, you tend to internalize it. You tend to feel angry about yourself. You tend to doubt yourself. And it's a very negative kind of emotion. And finally, we live in a time where people should say, I've had enough. This is not acceptable. It is not acceptable to have a leader like the moron that we have in the White House right now, who doesn't believe in climate change. That person is a criminal. He is a war criminal. He should be put in prison. That is this is not acceptable fate. This is not acceptable circumstances for us. We should not have to deal with all of the waste in this world. We should not be the ones, particularly in the United States, that are going to inherit a system that's completely bankrupt, where we're not going to be able to retire, where we can't find a job that pays better than our parents do. These circumstances that we are facing now, that I'm talking about you who are 20, 21, 22, they are not acceptable. This is not how the world should be, and we need to change it. And we need to convert this passive anger into something very positive and active. And we need to, anger, I say, human beings have a dark side. And I analyze it in my Laws of Human Nature. And that dark side can lead to the worst parts, the worst actions that we take. But it also contains a lot of energy and power. And you want to be able to use that kind of dark energy within you. And the way to use it is to put it towards a cause, to feel like there's something unjust in this world that we have to change, and to pour all of your energy into it, and to feel that anger and not be ashamed of it, not be embarrassed about it, because it's a positive sign. It means you're not going to accept the circumstances that are being foisted upon you by an older generation that has lived a comfortable life and is kind of living off the fat of the land and screwing you. So if I were 2021, I'd be really, really pissed off right now. And I would really want to like organize. I would really want to change this world. I often feel, I mean, I don't know if I'm going too far, but like in the United States, we need a second revolution. We need something really drastic. This is a system that's not working for even people my age, particularly for younger people. So this sense of we're a part of a generation now that needs to change this world. So in my last book, I have a chapter on generations and the whole pattern of generations. And people who studied it show that there's kind of 4 different kinds of generations. One is the revolutionary generation. The one that follows it is a generation that kind of consolidates what the revolutionary generation did. The third generation is one that's kind of conservative and is sort of lost sense of why they're there, and everything is kind of dogmatic and rigid. And the fourth generation is like chaos, and things are falling apart. And that leads to the revolutionary generation. So we've gone through the chaotic generation. I believe the millennials had that, where there's no real values, there's no real foundation. We all kind of feel lost. Like, what is the world supposed to be? And now the table has been set for a revolutionary generation that's going to create something new, that's going to create a new system of values, that's going to deal with things like global warming. It's going to finally deal with insane inequalities in wealth in this world, and you're going to change it. So, you know, I'm just trying to say, the last thing I'll say is, don't be afraid of that anger. Use it. It's incredibly necessary right now, because if young people become passive and sort of accept this and apathetic, I will get so angry. I will feel like you wasted this moment. This is your moment to kind of seize the stage. So that's what I.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely, as it was saying about using the anger for good and not being passive with it, but also take over and using that and making a revolution and doing something on behalf of all of the generations who need us and to come. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with T-minus. And it's so good to see you as someone who shares all those ideologies and really resonates with that and believes in what we're doing as well and is part of that mission. And that's super important for us as a generation. And maybe as a sort of a final telling us of advice and of sharing about how we can harness that anger and how we can move towards that revolution or that better world that's coming next. And if we're already taking for granted, or we're already assuming that the laws of human nature and all of your other books are already on our reading list, what other books might you recommend to us and the other generation that we should be reading right now, not only to help us through this and the pandemic at the moment, but seize that anger and use it for good in the future and really combine that with T-minus and everything else that we're looking to do in our revolution? What should we be reading?
Well, I didn't really think of it in terms of how to use your anger. That's a different way of approaching it. I'd have to, there are books that kind of, I know when I was younger, helped mobilize me in that direction. I'm trying to think of what they would be.
Whatever books you think what books you think we should be reading for whatever reason, really.
Well, you should be reading Man's Search for Meaning for sure. I highly recommend it, by Viktor Frankl. I also read a book recently that I really, really, really enjoyed. It's not, well, it's obviously in English, you can find it there. It's called The Sun Does Shine. It's by a man, I think his name is Anthony Ray Hinton, something like that. He was a young African-American who was arrested in the, I believe, early 80s for a crime he did not commit. And he was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. And he lived on death row for over 30 years, knowing he was innocent, knowing at any moment they were going to execute him. And his journey towards liberating himself from within, like we were talking about, to accepting his fate and finding a way to he felt incredible anger at the injustice of the system. And if you read the book, you will feel incredible anger at the American penal system as well. And he found a way to channel all of that anger into something very constructive. And eventually he was exonerated and set free after 35 years of being on death row, and he survived with his sanity and his humanity. I found an incredibly powerful book. I'm thinking of the autobiography of Malcolm X, which had a big impact on me when I was younger. That was a book that also dealt with kind of an anger about the world and how he was also in prison. It's a very similar book, and how he used the prison library to educate himself and find a way to channel that anger into something productive. Man, I don't know. Then some books on philosophy to kind of root yourself in some of the things we've been talking about. So I highly recommend that 16th century writer Montaigne, his essays, the French writer. He's an incredible writer, and he will help you sort of get control of your own emotions. And I wasn't prepared to answer it in this way, but those are some of the books that I was thinking. I know something great will come to me the moment I'm trying to think of what I read when I was younger that kind of motivated my sense of anger. I don't know.
Well,
Maybe I'll email it to you and
yes, please do. Something that we've really enjoyed reading is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday, and all those sorts of things. And I mean, the more suggestions, the better. So anything that you have all the time, send it or email it.
Well, Ryan used to be my apprentice, right?
Absolutely. Well, that's why we enjoy it so much.
I also recommend the essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American philosopher who is a favorite of Nietzsche. And anything by Nietzsche, of course, he's like my idol. So any of his books would be good. I don't know. I know something great will come to me. I'm so frustrated right now.
Something great always comes. Something great always comes. Well,
yeah,
those have all been really great suggestions as well that are really...
Okay. That's good to hear. Scratching my brain.
Oh, that's fine to keep scratching, but
I'm also kind of getting a little bit tired, so my brain isn't functioning so well.
Oh, well, if you think of something in your brilliant moment, which is always going to happen as soon as you switch it off, it's going to come, then you can always email it, and we'll be sure to include it and share it, because I know that everyone will so love to hear it.
Just read anybody who organized any kind of, okay, so for your situation like I'm talking about, for creating change in the world, I'm somebody who writes a lot about strategy. There's one really good book on that level called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I haven't, but I love the title.
It's not really, it's not as radical as you think. It's a very practical book about how to organize things. He was a community organizer in Chicago in the 50s and 60s. He had a huge impact on anybody who's worked in that world. And he was a really interesting thinker. He's going to show you how to organize a group to actually create change in this world. So
that's brilliant. And making change in the world is exactly what we care about, what we want to do when we want to be on board, and that's exactly what T-minus is about. And we hope that you'll consider being an ambassador with us and really help us on that journey to make T-minus.
Anytime.
Oh, that's so brilliant to hear. We need exactly people like you, brilliant minds and authors and writers and contributors. So we'd be so happy to have you on board as an ambassador.
We also need younger people desperately, because you're the ones that kind of generate actual culture and change in this world. So
we learn from all of the wise minds, and then we take the energy and the anger and we implement everything that we've been taught. So it's so brilliant to have both sides. And thank you so much for your time and all of your really valuable lessons. I think this is possibly the best interview that I've ever sat through, and I've learned so much for this situation and for life beyond. No, but thank you again so much for your time and for all the valuable contributions, and hopefully we'll be able to move forward with T-minus and all of the wonderful things to have that revolution that we've been talking about. So
Okay.
thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome.